today we are going to kick off this season talking about carbon, carbon, carbon. So we have Tom, Emily, and Henry here from the Carbon Removal Show. Would you all like to introduce yourselves?
Okay, thank you, Heather. Hi, everyone. It's really nice to be here, and yeah, happy to introduce myself a little bit. So my name is Emily Swaddle. I am one of the hosts of the Carbon Removal Show. I think we'll talk a bit more about the show in a minute, so I'll just introduce myself. I currently make a couple of different podcasts. I also work in training startups to measure their climate impact. And I'm also shifting much more towards the sense of caring for our planet and caring for ourselves, partly in a nature connection sense and partly through my organization called the Busy Optimists Collective, which you should totally look up, by the way. And in the past, I've worked in communities for climate action, climate education, and carbon removal is something that was really new to me before I started this show. It's something that I'd sort of heard whispers about and never fully understood or thought was a tangible thing. And that was one of the things that really drew me to this project. It's all about the learning and learning with the listener. Yeah, so that's me.
Great, cool. Yeah, lovely to be here. My name's Tom Praviti. I am the other host of the Carbon Removal Show alongside Emily. And I have been kind of working or transitioning into climate kind of related activities over the last 2 years or so. Prior to that, I was operating a charity in London and have since been kind of transitioning into the climate space. So the Carbon Removal Show, just like Emily said, was also very much like a big learning curve for me in kind of getting a grapple and understanding with that industry and climate more broadly. And at the moment, I'm also, well, I've just finished this 12-month impact program with a company called On Purpose. And I've just started at a carbon removal startup, actually, who's helping build a marketplace for the industry. So very, I guess, on trend with the show and things like that. So that's me. I'll pass to Henry.
Thanks, Tom. Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you all and see you all. I'm Henry Irvin. I am the researcher on the Carbon Removal Show. I didn't know a huge amount about carbon removal before I was the researcher on the show, but I had a climate background, generally in kind of climate science stuff. That's what I studied during undergraduate and postgraduate, and also some kind of policy side. I also was I had studied, and then also have some work experience working for a kind of climate consultancy, and now work when I'm not doing research on the Carbon Removal Show. I'm a civil servant in energy policy stuff. Yeah, that's me. I'm looking forward to talking to you all today.
Awesome. Thank you all for introducing yourselves. So carbon, 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 what are offsets and what are credits? And do offsets work? So that's 3 questions. Who wants to kick us off?
I could start. I could attempt, and then if anything falls through, then feel free to pick up, guys. But yeah, offsets, credits, do they work? It's lots of good questions. So totally, maybe actually worth asking, like, how familiar are you guys, the audience, with kind of offsetting, carbon credits, that whole kind of space? Is anybody, like, I don't know, if you know a bit about it, maybe put a thumbs up, otherwise thumbs down if you don't know much at all, or just, yeah, so okay, cool. Well, I'll kind of start from a level where hopefully everyone can like pick up from this. But in terms of what is a credit, like we talk about a carbon credit, that's essentially like a measurement. It's like kind of, when we talk about carbon credit, we always talk about 1 carbon credit, which equals 1 ton of carbon, either avoided or removed. in terms of like where we talk about on our show, the carbon removal show, we pretty much exclusively talk about one credit, which equals to 1 ton of carbon removed. But you've also got the avoidance credits, which are 1 ton of carbon avoided. Credits are kind of like, if you imagine the credit is the thing that you purchase, it's that ton, and then you can decide if you want to use that credit to offset, for example, your emissions. You don't necessarily have to use the credit to offset your emissions. That's something that people get confused actually sometimes. You don't need to do that, but it's kind of like what you do with that credit could be to just offset your emissions. And so when we talk about offsetting, we're talking about essentially your organization, if we took that as an example, has a footprint, a carbon footprint released, you know, say you've emitted 50 tons of CO2 or greenhouse gases, last year, and you want to offset that and bring that back to zero, you'll purchase 50 credits, which equate to 50 tons, ideally of something like a carbon removal credit. So you're essentially offsetting your way to kind of, reach parity or net zero, as people might say. Do they work? There's a long history of projects that may have failed in the past, especially around avoidance, and also some forestry projects. Overcrediting is an example of things like that. Forest fires, there's situations where things haven't worked out so well. But if you then look at a kind of a more durable, permanent carbon removal credit, that's something which you could say is potentially more legitimate and is kind of scientifically backed by the IPCC report, for example, which recently came out stating that there's a kind of a clear need for something like this. I've waffled a bit, but Henry, Emily, what do you guys think?
Yeah, I think it's wonderful, Tom. And I just wanted to add, because your explanation there of what offsetting is and why we have carbon credits sounds very much like it could just be an excuse for people to keep emitting and then buy credits and just offset and job done, which there is the potential for it to be that. And the hope is that it isn't that. And your question, Heather, of does it work? That's one of the sort of main turning points of this. But the other side of that, the sort of ignition of the idea of offsetting isn't really to let people continue with business as usual. It's to actually support the things like the carbon removal industry. So it's a way of finding a monetary value in carbon removal, which in itself quite often can be a really hard thing to bring into a sort of consumerist capitalist system. This idea of we're removing carbon, so we know the environmental value that brings, but what financial value does that bring? And adding a credit to that is bringing it into a market in a way that we can actually work with it in our system. So that's sort of a way of thinking about it that may help to offset, if I may, the sort of business as usual trap that it feels like it can fall into. Would you agree with that, Henry?
Yeah, definitely. I think as you were both talking through that there, I was kind of thinking about offsets at different scales. And you can think about, there are infinite number of scales you can think about this on, but if we think about say I take a flight and I want to offset my impact through taking that flight, well, first of all, I should definitely consider whether I need to take that flight. So that's kind of the first thing that you consider with offsetting is, can we get rid of that emission and make it never happen in the first place, which is better than having to deal with it later. But say I have to take the flight and then I'm looking for ways to offset my impact there. I think this is where you can really see or understand the difference between avoidance and removal credits, because if I opted for an avoidance credit, then if you think about the impact on the atmosphere, then I might have paid for some better refrigerator management somewhere in the world, and that's just avoided some emissions happening. But really, the net impact to the atmosphere is still my flight has increased carbon emissions in the atmosphere, and I've just prevented some other carbon emissions happening. With a removal credit, I have my impact, and then theoretically somewhere else in the world I have the opposite impact, which has gone off camera. But you can kind of tell if there's a zero axis here, then the two are leveling out. So that's something to consider with offsets, definitely. Just thinking about an economy-wide or worldwide scale, what offsetting does. I guess this is when we start to think about net zero and what net zero means. And net zero means that you have a balance of emissions and removals. It doesn't mean you have a balance of emissions and avoided emissions. I mean, that would not make any sense, and the atmosphere would not thank us for that. So yeah, I think when we're thinking about net zero and the role that offsets play in that, then there need to be certain principles which make sure the offsetting that you're funding or a country is supporting kind of aligns with the ultimate net zero goal. And we can talk a bit more about that later on, but I'll stop rambling there.
That's all really helpful and really good, I think, level setting. Like if you're coming into this, you don't know anything about any of it. I think that is a very good synopsis. Thinking about avoidance versus removal, how, as an individual or as a business, would you go about offsetting, right? So let's talk about projects, different types of ways you can do this, businesses that you can support. What would be your first step to offsetting? Emily, let's start with you.
I think actually the first couple of steps, the first one is understanding your impact. So measuring your current emissions and doing that in a way that is as accurate as possible, because it's actually really difficult. And there's a lot of sort of parameters you have to set and understand the scope of the measurements, and that can be a whole thing. And then I'd say the next step is, as Henry said, thinking about if you need to take that flight, like, can you actually reduce before you start thinking about offsetting? Which, as much as we love to talk about carbon removal on our show, we also love to highlight that carbon emissions reduction needs to be the first step of everything. So that would be the first two steps, if I may. And then when you're like, okay, we've got as low as we can go, we know what that is, and we're still working on trying to get lower, but we want to offset. And then the next thing is to probably do a bit of research, because there are so many different options. And there's a lot that comes into what makes a good offset and what makes a sort of less reliable offset. And yeah, the part of it, I think, has to be a sort of personal choice about what you value and what for you is going to mean the most. So there'll be some projects that work really closely with local communities, and that might be really important to you. I personally think that's essential for making any of these projects sustainable. It might be that you're looking at projects that have other sort of side benefits. For instance, so a lot of people will plant trees. That's the sort of go-to one for your offsets, is planting trees, which is great. Does cause some issues, which we talk about on the show, but it's great for many other reasons as alongside carbon. So trees and forests, they have huge benefits for the planet, for other ecosystems, for biodiversity, for humans, just so much. So there's a lot there. But if you're solely looking at carbon, planting trees is maybe not the best way to go. So it's really a question of like where your values lie and what you want to focus on. And I want to pass it over to somebody else so that they can tell you their bit as well.
I'd be happy to pick up on some other approaches. So yeah, so you talked about, Heather, you mentioned like how would one go about finding a project? Emily said that you need to do some research, and that's kind of like that's kind of a really good starting point. You need to understand what you're getting into before you kind of purchase anything. If you're committing to buy credits to offset your personal footprint or professional business footprint. But yeah, as we said, there's like a spectrum of projects that you can pick from, starting at the avoidance end. So these are the the traditional ones that would have been created after the Kyoto Protocol a while back, and have been kind of the ones that we would have heard and seen about up until very recently. So that's like some traditional forestry projects, kind of efficient cook stove projects, renewable energy projects. That's a kind of avoidance credit. But as Henry said, it doesn't actively remove CO2 from the atmosphere. It just prevents more from being emitted. Then you get into the carbon removals projects, and you kind of have this spectrum of very nature-based, which would be like forestry projects, afforestation, reforestation, where you're really generating forests that may not have been there previously or had previously been deforested. And then you kind of go all the way along up to a very, very engineered scale. So you go from tree planting to soil carbon sequestration, which is essentially like making sure that the soil is regenerated as much as possible on farmland, such that it can store carbon away. It's actually an incredibly good carbon store, but it's quite difficult to predict whether it's going to be released in 5 years' time due to a flood or farming practices, that kind of thing. So there's pros and cons to each, but you continue to go up. You have something like biochar, which is essentially really basic description, which is not how you should take it on face value, but it looks like charcoal. And the only difference with biochar versus charcoal is that you've taken the wood, for example, or cuttings from some sort of biomass plant, and you've burnt it at a really, really, really high heat, and you've removed the oxygen, such that the carbon that was in the plant is like stored and locked away in it, and it's very, very hard for bacteria and fungi to eat that away. So that's kind of a more permanent approach. And then you go all the way up to CO2 mineralization, which is essentially like enhancing a natural process of when rain hits rock, it kind of calcifies, and the CO2 that was in the rainwater attaches itself, mineralizes to the rock itself. That's a really interesting approach. And then you have like direct air capture, which is the one that everyone sees on the news, the big fans that suck ambient air through them, extract the CO2 and spit out air with low CO2 in it, and then you pump the CO2 underground and store it permanently. But on that spectrum, you've got approaches. That's a nice cap. You have approaches that are like the natural ones are usually cheaper, usually less permanent. But then on the engineered approach, on that spectrum, you've got projects that are a lot more expensive, potentially like 500 to £1,000 a ton. So for one credit, but they potentially are a lot more permanent. And so there's kind of, you've got to weigh it up, as Emily said, what you're interested in personally, what you believe in. There isn't a clear trajectory for one offset approach that's going to be the silver bullet. You kind of have to look at a portfolio, especially as you get a bit bigger with an organization, for example. But if it's a personal footprint, it's only going to be a couple of tons. So you could potentially just look at one approach. That makes sense?
Completely. Yes, absolutely. Henry, you just came off mute. Do you want to add some stuff?
Yeah, well, I really can't add much to what Emily and Tom said. That was very comprehensive. I think maybe something to consider here, which doesn't directly answer the question, but just your overall strategy to offsetting. So there is guidance available if you, and guidance in lots of places. Something that came out, I think, which I find particularly helpful, are the Oxford offsetting principles, or Oxford principles for offsetting, or something like that. And they kind of give 4 clear steps to what good offsetting looks like, or try to address some of those kind of knotty questions that you come to when thinking about how should I offset my my footprint. So the first thing they say, the first step in their 4-step strategy, is to cut emissions first, and then basically only use offsets for your really hard to remove emissions, and then keep that offsetting strategy under review as over time, because if you continue to emit residual emissions, then you're going to continue to need to offset them, and the offsetting space will change a lot in the next 10, 20, 30 years. So that's step 1, cut emissions first. That should be your focus. Step 2 is they recommend shifting towards carbon removal offsetting. So that's, Tom described that very well, and the kind of the techniques that are available in that space. Step 3 is linked to that. It's shifting to long-lived storage of carbon. So as both Tom and Emily were saying, that there are differences between all the different techniques. There are differences in the permanence, so how long they lock away the carbon for. And yes, there might be a role for short-lived locking away of carbon. Maybe that helps us to manage our CO2 for the next 50 years or 10 years. But then you've got to question, how short is just actually not useful to us on a planetary scale. So yeah, shifting towards more permanent things that can lock away the carbon reliably for tens of thousands of years, really. And then the final thing is supporting the development of net zero aligned offsetting. So I think this is all about kind of trying to boost the market for good offsets now, rather than thinking, oh, I don't need to. No one else is buying these good offsets. I can get a cheap offset and be my conscience is clean. So this is things like trying to sign up to long-term agreements with offsetting companies or carbon removal companies, and then that gives them some certainty of, yes, I know I've got this income coming in. So it's kind of trying to build up the market for carbon removal, long-lived storage now. So yeah, that's a quick run through the Oxford principles, and I think they're quite useful for thinking about how your offsetting could work. The final thing I will say is that we had a guest on season 1 of the show, and something he was saying really interested me, which was all around kind of good not being the enemy of perfect. So if I have if my organization has 10 tons that it needs to offset, then do I buy, and I've only got £1,000 or $1,000 to offset with, do I try to offset the whole amount with cheaper offsets, or do I just spend that $1,000 or pounds on a really good quality offset? So which doesn't necessarily kind of remove all 10 tons that I need to remove, but it does really reliably remove 1 ton instead. I've just been asked who that was. It wasn't Ben Knight. I think it was someone called Andrew Shabir, who's an angel investor. I can't actually fully remember his background, but maybe Tom or Emily can.
Counteract. Yeah, he runs a VC called Counteract that does carbon removal investments, or invest in carbon removal companies.
I really like that quote. I've heard that a couple of times, especially when it comes to this space. It's don't let perfection get in the way of good, or something like that. Is kind of similar to what you're saying. I see Chris, we have a hand up. I just want to go back quickly. But I'll just, Chris, do you want to pop off me and ask your question? Then I'll revert back to the ones I have.
Sure, I was following on really from the Oxford principles you shared that seem to very strongly lean towards removal offsetting. But I was just, while you were speaking, I was also thinking, what's wrong with supporting the rollout of lower carbon cook stoves in various other areas, or what's wrong with helping to securely remove refrigeration from antiquated systems somewhere in places which it's really expensive to do that, or it's expensive in local terms to do that. So should it be a yes and rather than an either or on sort of avoidance? So rather than saying 1 ton of my stuff is 1 ton of removal, it's like 1 ton of my stuff is a ton of removal and half a ton of making up for the fact that I've had 70 years of my stuff going out before we even started thinking about this.
I think that's a good point. And I think these principles are maybe more aimed at trying to improve the quality of offsets and push more people towards removal, but recognizing that there is still a place for avoidance credits, or just kind of funding good climate action and effective climate action, but not necessarily using that and claiming that as an offset. Yeah, I mean, to follow on from the example I was talking about, if you had $1,000 that you were trying to offset your footprint with, maybe you just completely drop the term of like offsetting and say, actually, I think the most effective climate intervention with this money is to put that towards clean stoves, and I think that will have that will be a really effective way of spending the money that we have for trying to make up for our impact. So it's maybe, I think, I mean, it'll be interesting to speak to the people behind the principles, and to understand that they're thinking behind that. But I've understood it as, if you want to claim that your carbon offset or carbon credit is actually offsetting your emissions, then this is the principles you should follow. But then there are definitely other useful things to do. Tom, Emily?
Yeah, I think you covered what I was going to say in response to that, Henry. And essentially, I think it has to be both. Like, I don't think we can do enough of either, really. And as a climate conscious person, and if you're looking to not only offset your emissions currently, but also contribute to better practices around the world, then yeah, both. It has to be both. And that's part of what I was saying before about, we talk about cutting emissions being really important, but you know, our focus is obviously carbon removal on the show. And the two, there's no argument of avoiding one in order to do the other one. We don't want to take the spotlight away from that. And I think your point is really valid, Chris, that we definitely need both.
I think it's really interesting to talk about the inclusivity of climate intervention and climate action when you're as well thinking about offsetting, right? Offsetting removal isn't the be all end all of it. So when we're talking in the Salon in context of carbon, we are ClimateAction.tech. So take action as well, always, first and foremost. But yeah, I think that's a really good way to kind of clarify all of that. I want to go back a little bit to, I think it was Tom, when you were talking about just talking about the good or less reliable offsets. Can we dive into that a little bit? So what makes a good offset and what makes a less reliable offset?
Yeah, what is good and what's bad? There's there's a load of different, well, not a load, but there is some criteria which is becoming the general consensus on what makes something good and another project less good. So when it comes to the projects that I kind of mentioned, some of the different approaches that you have, like two things that you look at, which I've already talked about, are like the durability or the permanence. So how long, if we're looking at carbon removal as an example, how long will that carbon be taken out of the carbon cycle for? That's essentially what we're trying to do here. We're trying to take carbon dioxide out of the current cycle because there's too much of it in our atmosphere and in our biosphere. So how long can it be permanently taken away from? If it's very, very short term, there's, you know, if we purchase a credit and it lasts 10 years, for 10 years it'll be taken out, but then in 10 years time it will come back again. So then we'll have to then buy that credit and then another credit for the next 10 years. So we're making sure that we're not just buying one credit to, I'm going to rabbit hole, but yeah. Anyway, durability, permanence is one metric that you can look at. The other might be something to take into account, which is cost. You know, is it like, are you able to afford the project? If it's, you know, if you've only got a budget of £1,000, but but a carbon removal direct air capture credit costs £1,000, like that, sometimes it can be a bit infeasible to be spending on that sort of thing. Whereas you might want to find something that's a little bit in between. Another thing you might want to consider is the like resource use that goes into the projects. So you can look at something like land use of a project. If you look at direct air capture, for example, generally doesn't use loads of land because you have a centralized kind of factory essentially over a few acres, versus a reforestry project. You'll be taking back land that may have been farmland or something else. And so there's competing resource use that you might want to take into account there. You've also got a slightly thorny subject called additionality, which if I'm not butchering it, would the offset benefit have occurred without your intervention anyway? So essentially, was that forest always going to be there, and wasn't a danger of being deforested, for example? Or yeah, Henry or Emily, you might want to come in and just like confirm that I've said that correctly.
Yeah, there's the question of additionality is maybe I'm going to butcher it too, and then we'll have to get Henry in to really clean up this mess. But yeah, the question of additionality is sort of making sure that when you're buying any kind of offsetting credit, that it's actually making an impact, that the impact that it's claiming to have, whether that's avoiding an emission or removing a ton of carbon. But with additionality, we're more talking about the avoidance credits, if I'm not mistaken. And the question becomes, would that ton of carbon be avoided anyway? And actually, is the fact that you're buying this credit having that impact, or is it just like they're sticking a label on something that's already happening? If I can just add to your list, Tom, I would also bring in the question of measurability, which is something we mentioned with sort of natural solutions versus more engineered solutions, that it can be really hard to actually measure how much carbon you're capturing or how many tons of carbon emissions you're avoiding. And that's actually a really important part of all of this, especially when it comes to the reliability of these credits. How much are you actually removing? And I think, as with anything, and I sort of mentioned this when I talked earlier about how you make these choices, as with anything that you purchase, you want to be looking at the effect that it's having, beyond that direct impact of carbon. So is it using land? Does that land belong to Indigenous people, or is it land that's covered in biodiversity? Is there an impact in terms of any minerals that are needed to have this project. So all those kind of questions. We go into all this stuff in a lot of detail in the first season of the show. So yeah, if you want to learn more about all the different, and like with lots of different sort of specific techniques and stuff, and we go into quite a lot of detail, fact checked by our very own Henry Irvin. So it's pretty good stuff.
So that's my cue. I mean, I can't really add to that list, and neither of you butchered additionality, in my opinion. I think my reflection on this long list of what good looks like is that I find myself, when I think about all of this stuff, becoming quite purist about carbon removal. Like, it's got to be the most permanent, the most additional, the most measurable. It's just got to be perfect. And then kind of really find myself feeling the general doom when there's kind of another offsetting scandal, or just think, oh, we're so far away from this. And I think generally at the point of trying to get a market up and running, there are going to be some scandals along the way. And we do need to push for these higher standards. But actually, with our long list of what good looks like at the moment, it's really, really hard for a project to achieve that. And not that they shouldn't aspire to that, but I don't think in our carbon offsetting today, we can realistically look for these types of project. I think we need to think about how we're kind of developing the right kinds of projects, which can then later reach these kind of, I don't want to say gold standards, because that's the name of a scheme. But it does link on to a question in the chat about different standards. I guess that's what that's getting at. So I'm not too familiar with the kind of intricate details of each standard. I can only give really a very high level overview of, there are a lot of standards out there for offsetting, and they all have slightly different approaches. And there's work going on at the moment to try and unify kind of what good looks like. And I don't know if Tom or Emily know any more about this, but I think there's the task force on voluntary carbon markets or something like that, which is doing a lot of work trying to work out what the standards should be. So this is very much kind of a live, open question, and very much an area also, I think, of kind of some scientific uncertainty as well. So yeah, I guess watch this space on what happens there.
On the standards and certifications, like, yeah, you've got gold standard, you've got Vera, you've got Red Plus, which is more of a forestry credit. But yeah, as Henry said, like, it's kind of a Wild West. There isn't a single source of truth for getting a credit that you've purchased, like bulletproof. This is the gold standard, because there are so many different bodies, and that's just down to the nature of this kind of, the whole fact that this market, we're talking about the voluntary carbon market, has just kind of sprung up over the last 15 years or so, and there isn't any regulation so much around it. Yeah, that's what people are really trying to focus on at the moment. And what's happening at COP26, what happened at COP26 was there was some confirmation made around compliance markets, which is getting a little bit into the weeds of things. But if you imagine you've got two different carbon markets, so you've got a compliance market and the voluntary carbon market. The compliance market is kind of the government level, country level, kind of listed company level kind of marketplace for essentially trading and buying carbon credits. the vast majority are currently avoidance credits, but there's a cap and trade scheme essentially where countries and companies at a certain, well, companies at a certain size are given a budget of their emissions each year. And if they go over that budget, they are allowed to buy some credits or buy some of a budget, from other companies that haven't gone over their budget. And so you've got the compliance market on one side, which is getting a bit confusing, but we're not talking about the compliance market. We're talking about the voluntary carbon market, which is all individuals, companies that are smaller, wanting to voluntarily offset, purchase credits, and grow the industry. And that's what we're ultimately trying to do with the Carbon Removal Show, is grow the industry such that when we reach a certain point in time, as the IPCC report state in their research, that we're going to need to have offsetting, pretty much removal offsetting, at a certain scale by 2030, 2040, 2050. And we're not going to get there if we don't invest now. And so people buying these credits now is kind of proving there's demand for the industry and also helping it grow. It's kind of like the solar industry. If you look at that as an example, like solar panels were super expensive, and just when they first launched, and the technology wasn't so efficient, and then the cost curve came down, demand increased, the product improved, and now that it's incredibly cheap. Hopefully that's going to be a similar approach with offsetting through carbon removal mainly, as the years go on. And the SBTI is a framework that lots of organizations use to measure their footprint, measure their I guess their climate impact, mainly through greenhouse gases, pretty much exclusively through greenhouse gases. And it's stands for the Science Based Targets Initiative. So lots of companies sign up to that, and they sign up and they kind of set a path to be aligned with 1.5 degrees of warming. It's actually different from net zero somewhat, but that's another conversation.
I saw someone come off mute. Are there any questions from the group? I have some more, so.
I have one. Hello?
Go for it.
There are actually two. One is like, if you go, for example, and you read what Greenpeace thinks of offsetting, that it's mainly, or not mainly, but it is used for greenhouse gases profiteers, as they call them, right? They use them as a get out of jail for free card. Right, they just buy something and to just keep on business as usual. Like there's a psychological factor there too. So what would be the opinion of the group about that? And the second question is, how can I, like as a regular person, find out the quality of the offset project and how easy it is? I've seen people trying to do some offsetting, and then they can't find like an actual project that they can give money to easily.
I feel like I've said a lot. I'm happy to continue chatting, but I feel like Henry, Emily, one of you guys can, yeah.
I was just going to talk about Mike Childs, Tom.
Yes, yes.
We spoke to Mike Childs, who works for Friends of the Earth. He's the head of policy and research there for Friends of the Earth UK. And I think, Vinko, this really speaks to your point of people like Greenpeace and other such organizations. Sort of, there's a lot of anxiety around offsetting in that space. And I think that actually a lot of the pushback to offsetting and carbon removal comes from the climate activism movement. It's a conversation that I personally have had a lot with my friends who are involved in that space. And to be honest, really, I think it comes down to this question of the nuance and understanding the whole space. Especially this idea that it isn't one or the other. We have to reduce emissions and we have to remove carbon. And you know, the more that I've learned about this and the more that we've talked about it on the show, the more obvious it becomes to me that we do really need both. Like removing carbon isn't an added extra that we can do at some point. It really needs to happen. We've just got too far down the line now of emissions to allow us to move forward without removing carbon. And when I managed to have those one-on-one conversations with my friends who are critical of this and also critical of net zero, there's a lot of talk around, well, we shouldn't be aiming for net zero, we should be aiming for zero, or like net zero just means you can emit as much as you want and then just offset it all, and that's a load of rubbish because that's just not going to work for our environment. And again, I come back to this point of nuance. Like, there isn't, for me, a good enough definition of net zero with just those two words. You have to say within X time frame, and we're also holding on to this condition that we are going to reduce by X amount. And, you know, it has to be more detailed than that. There have to be conditions in order for me to accept net zero as a concept. So I really think it is this question of like nuance, and that's where it gets difficult as a discussion among, you know, on a sort of like societal level, because it's not easy. We can't just say, yes, we'll do it, or no, we won't, because it depends on the offset, depends on the removal solution. It depends on so many things. And that was actually one of the things of our show that we really wanted to do, was to allow people to like get more into that discussion, to understand it more, and to have an idea of those details, so that when they hear things about offsetting, when they see the discussions in the newspaper or whatever from Friends of the Earth or Greenpeace or whoever, that they can understand that not all offsets are created equal, that not everyone who's buying offsets is doing it with the same intentions, and that offsets are actually vitally important. It's not the tool's fault, I think, is what I'm trying to say, that the tool itself isn't the issue, but maybe how it's used can become an issue. Yeah, Tom's just posted the episode where we talked to Mike Childs, so check that out. And I'm really sorry, I've forgotten the second part of your question because I rambled on so long about the first part.
I think it was about projects, vetting, finding projects.
Yeah, actually, it ties a bit to what you just like said, that it depends so much on the quality and the details of each project. How can like regular people find the right projects that are also easily, that you can easily donate to as well?
Something which you might find useful, Binko, but I'll see what Henry and Emily think as well. Something you might find useful is if you, well, firstly, make the distinction, like, do you want to invest in kind of more of an avoidance project, which will have other benefits potentially, like the more efficient cook stoves, but perhaps be aware that that isn't removing CO2 from the atmosphere, it's just avoiding it. So that's more on the reduction side. But if you want to, and there's good places to look there. So I think, what are they called? Climate Care. Climate Care, we can link, are a good organization that have a huge list on their website, which you can look through for those more avoidance projects. If you're looking at carbon removal specific, it's a lot trickier to invest in those as an individual, just because they are so nascent in their development, and lots of projects will actually look to only sell like 1,000 tons in bulk because it's more cost effective and it's just the way that they're set up to operate. But if you're looking at trying to vet projects and find ones that you may be able to invest in from a removal perspective, a good place to look could be the gold standard. It could be a website called Vera, VERA, I think. Or you could also look at companies like Stripe. Stripe are a really good example of an organization that's taken matters into their own hands with carbon removal, and they've actually invested in lots and lots of different carbon removal projects, and they have their own kind of like vetting approach they've taken to this. So you could look at the companies that Stripe, the projects that Stripe has invested in, as potentially a good benchmark, because them, Microsoft as well, Shopify are three very good examples of organizations that have done a very, very thorough job at this carbon removal kind of project investing. I think Climeworks, which is a direct air capture company, might sell direct air capture in kilograms, but you won't find that very often. Pretty much it'll always be in tons, and 1 credit is a ton. So there's hopefully some brain dump there.
Yeah, I just put Climeworks in the chat, Tom, because they have a subscription service that you can sign up to as an individual, which is actually a really nice sort of easy way to get into it.
And of course, you can listen to the Carbon Removal Show and learn more about the sector, and then you'll be super informed when you go to buy your own offsets.
Absolutely. And we will include links, all the links to the show, to Climeworks, to everything that you've mentioned. I'm going to wrap it up now, and thank you to our panelists, Emily, Tom, Henry. You were great. And thank you so much for joining us, for providing your insights. We look forward to seeing you at our next Salon.